All right, thank you everyone for joining us for today's webinar, The Latest Cyber Threats and Expert Tips for Defense. My name is Jenna Kadich. I am a Product Marketing Specialist at WatchGuard Technologies, and today I'm lucky enough to be joined by two cybersecurity experts, Corey Nachreiner, CTO, and Marc Laliberte, Information Security Analyst. Now guys, Marc and Corey are on WatchGuard's Threat Lab team, which in part means that they put in a lot of time researching the biggest security challenges on the threat landscape today and how best to evade them. We've got a lot of great information ahead for you. Before I hand things over to Marc and Corey, I have just a few really quick housekeeping notes. Guys, if you have a question at any point, please don't hesitate to let us know. Just type your question into your Bright Talk Questions panel, and we will take a look at the end of the presentation. Now also, please be sure to check out your Bright Talk Attachments tab for two great resources. We've got the PowerPoint deck that's going to be used by Corey and Marc today attached there, as well as the Q2 Internet Security Report that Corey and Marc worked on that we based today's presentation off of. So a lot of really great resources there. Please be sure to check it out. And that's all I have on my end, and I'll hand it over to Corey and Marc.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, which really covers the latest cyber threats that we got from the Q2 Internet Security Report, a quarterly Internet Security Report we do here at WatchGuard. As Jenna mentioned, my name's Corey. I'm here with Marc, and we know all the cybers. Sorry, early morning here in Seattle, bad joke. But as she mentioned, we both actually spend a lot of our days researching cybersecurity. To give you a quick introduction, I'm the CTO, Chief Technology Officer here at WatchGuard. Been here for quite a long time, and besides my new role of actually managing WatchGuard's security strategy, figuring out what new security products we want to build into the fold, I also manage our Threat Labs team, a group of researchers that follows the internet underground, follows all the latest news, researches the latest threats and malware to make sure that we can make sure our products block all this stuff, but also to inform the public how to kind of protect themselves from the growing threats. With that, why don't you introduce yourself as well, Marc?
Hey guys, I'm Marc Laliberte, and as Corey mentioned, I'm on the WatchGuard Threat Lab team, and I'm excited to be here and talk about our security report today.
Cool. So with that said, let's dive right in, and we'll go ahead and start with kind of the summary of the report. If you read our report, we start with an executive summary, the biggest takeaways. And here are some of the things that we saw this quarter. I don't know if you want to start off, Marc.
Sure. So one of the major themes that we saw overall throughout all services that we cover when it comes to malware or network threats was credential theft seemed to be a very common theme. We saw Mimikatz reach our top 10 list for, I believe, the first time this last quarter, and then we saw a lot of different JavaScript-based attacks towards password theft, and then also some different Linux vulnerabilities that could grab things like the etc password D file from Linux hosts, and then brute force attempts against web servers.
And by the way, we'll go into some of these in more detail. If you haven't heard of Mimikatz, we'll definitely tell you what it is. But as Marc mentioned, the entire theme of this was all about authentication and stolen credentials. There's a number of things we track in our report. One is malware. What are the top 10, top 100, top 1,000 malware variants that our tens of thousands of fireboxes are detecting around the world? So that, Mimikatz and a few other of the malware hits suggested that people were stealing credentials. Again, we'll describe Mimikatz in more detail soon. But then IPS, we also track intrusion prevention. So any sort of network-based software exploits that bad guys are using against your networks. And again, the two of them that will go into more detail, the brute force attack you see there and the Linux etc password issue, those are both attacks that are really trying to go after authentication mechanisms, either stealing passwords and or kind of brute forcing passwords. And finally, as Marc mentioned, we saw a lot of malicious JavaScript. We've actually seen a lot of malicious JavaScript in every single one of our quarterly reports. But one of the new things that popped up this time was JavaScript-based phishing. And again, as you probably know, a lot of phishing attacks are designed to steal credentials too. So I really would say the overall theme of this quarter was many attacks going after credentials, passwords, And really, it's because that is the weakest link in security. You know, we spend all this time creating security controls like the ones Firebox, you know, our WatchGuard provides in our Firebox that give you all kinds of great protections. You can set up policies to make sure external people have no access to things they shouldn't, but all your internal people can come right in and get access to everything they need. The problem is the way you authenticate that trusted user. If a bad guy gets that legitimate credential, pretty much he gets past all your security controls. So I think this quarter, the theme was definitely authentication, and you can see that threat actors out there are really going after, you know, our passwords.
So one of the things that we track in our quarterly report every single quarter are just general statistics. How many different malware variants did we block? How many different network attacks did we detect and block? And then overall, we keep this number that we call the zero-day malware number, which is the number of malware samples that were not detected by signature-based detection. So if you're not familiar with WatchGuard products, we actually have two different ways of catching malware, trying to make it into your network. We have our signature-based detection, which we call gateway antivirus, and we have our advanced malware sandboxing detection, which uses behavioral detection to catch the things that signatures might miss. Both of those put together this last quarter actually caught over 16 million different malware variants, which is a absolutely massive number, and it was up, I believe, 41% compared to last quarter, which is a huge jump. Now, last quarter we noted that we saw malware attacks down from the previous quarter. Yeah. Whether this is a rebalancing of that or just a huge spike is still to be told.
Yeah, it's hard to say. And to remind you, the before Q2, the biggest malware we saw was in Q4 of 2016. And then in what Marc's referring to is in Q1, malware hits dropped. And we suspect that might have to do with seasonality of certain attack campaigns. Obviously, Q4 has a lot of holiday shopping seasons. There's a lot of, you know, pop culture and holiday type things that attackers, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, that attackers build a lot of their malware campaigns around. So that's why we assumed it dropped in Q1. But as you say, it went back up in Q2, so it could be a resurgence. Perhaps, I didn't really think of it. I'm not sure if there's any seasonal things that go on in Q2 that spam campaigns go after. But they definitely pay attention to holidays, pop culture, even crazy events like the environmental fires, floods, hurricanes, anything like that suddenly generate lots of emails asking for donations. A lot of these cyber criminals leverage that too.
Yep, and one of the other major stats that we track quarter over quarter are what we call network attacks. At WatchGuard, we have this tool called Intrusion Prevention Service, where we're actually looking for exploits of vulnerabilities in systems, whether it be a SQL injection or a brute force attempt or anything along those lines.
Apache.
Exactly. And in quarter two, we stopped in 2.9 million of these network attacks, and that's actually down 30% from the previous quarter. Now, one more stat that we actually catch is what we call our zero-day malware number.
And before you say this stat, just to be very clear for the audience,
yes.
Zero-day has a couple different connotations in InfoSec. A lot of people refer to zero-day as in zero-day exploits, which would relate to network attacks more than malware. A zero-day exploit would be a vulnerability in a software product that hasn't been discovered, hasn't been patched, and therefore has no protection. When we use the term zero-day malware with the malware after, we mean a whole different thing. What we mean is a new malware variant, that legacy-based antivirus, any antivirus that's largely signature-based, or even if it goes a bit beyond signatures, but it's kind of rules. It's looking for patterns that suggest a certain malware family. The problem is threat actors are able to change their variants so quickly that a lot of these pattern-based things get behind, and thus pattern-based AV doesn't catch it. So just to be very clear, when we say zero-day malware, we actually mean a piece of malware that's undetected by pattern-based security.
Correct. So when it comes to zero-day malware, we actually found that in quarter two of last year, 40% or 47% of all malware that we detected would have been classified as zero-day malware, meaning if you were only using signature-based detection, that malware would have gotten through and potentially infected your systems.
And that's up. That's the biggest number we've seen yet.
The absolute biggest number.
3/4 of this report. And just to remind you, Mark earlier told you the difference between our two AV detections. One is called Gateway Antivirus. And while it does a number of things, it's a little bit more than just signatures. It is primarily pattern-based. And then we have APT blocker, as he mentioned, which is the behavioral-based. And all we basically do is any device that has APT blocker, we see how many GAV hits it got, Gateway Antivirus hits it got, and we compare that to what APT blocker caught. Because if APT blocker caught it, it actually did get past our GAV.
Exactly. So with that said, we can actually dive a bit deeper into our malware stats specifically. One of the things that we compile every quarter is our top 10 list of GAV hits. So these are actual malware detections on our fireboxes out in the field. And we try and dive into different patterns and trends we see, along with a few specific examples for different variants. And one of the things that really jumped out this year was our number one hit overall, and I believe 6 hit overall, for both different variants of Mimikatz, which is actually a kind of old tool.
Yeah, it's been around for a while.
It has, and it was originally developed by a researcher, as he claims, a way to, for research purposes, to recover credentials from Windows computers. And it's kind of grown over the year with more features, but overall it is still basically a password stealing and hash stealing tool for Microsoft Windows.
And we'll talk about that more in the next slide. I will say, though, part of why we do the top 10 is just to kind of give you an overall feel of what is the most popular type of malware or threat out there. And one of the things we see from a network level is we're often not seeing what security researchers like us call the second stage or child payload. The way malware works nowadays is because these threat actors are trying to evade security controls, the first thing they send to your computer isn't typically the Trojan or botnet or ransomware they want to infect you with. The first thing they send is something they either call a downloader or dropper. It's a small bit of code, a staged tool that hopefully is better at evading antivirus, and its only goal is to get on your computer and then grab the real thing, the real ransomware in many cases, while trying to still disable any security you have locally. So one thing we've been noticing consistently every quarter is often, unlike the Mimikatz, often what we see at a network level in our top 10 list are these droppers and downloaders or other tools that are designed to actually deliver the real malware, which would eventually be a Trojan or backdoor. So that's why you see a lot of generic droppers and Trojans here. But it was interesting this quarter that we actually saw named threats like Mimikatz, like a particular Perl IRC bot, although I do consider Word documents kind of like droppers. Word documents are usually just that first stage trying to get you to go download something else through embedded script.
Exactly. And on top of that, one thing that we've seen over the past few quarters is there's a lot of JavaScript-based malware that we detect.
Yeah.
Usually JavaScript is commonly used as those dropper files. But as we mentioned earlier, one of the big JavaScript-based variants we saw this quarter, was actually used in phishing attacks. And we'll get into that in another slide here in a little bit.
Yeah. But let's go ahead and transition to Mimikatz. If you haven't heard of Mimikatz, Marc gave you a great intro of it. It is a cool tool. It was created by good guys as a penetration testing tool, but it's actually built into a lot of payloads now. In fact, there's been recent news of ransomware. I believe the new ransomware that's called Bad Rabbit actually had Mimikatz built into it as one of the ways it tried to infect other computers. But essentially what Mimikatz does, like Marc said, it steals Windows passwords in any way it can. It'll do old tricks like steal the local SAM database, which is the hashes on the local Windows computer. It can monitor network traffic and actually grab hashes that are passing over the network. But one of its most interesting capabilities now is it leverages some memory flaws, I guess they're not flaws, I don't think Microsoft will fix them, but some of the ways that Microsoft stores passwords in memory, and it's actually one of the few tools that in some cases can pull clear text passwords. Instead of the hash which you have to crack, you could actually see a clear text password of someone that's recently logged into the system. So it's a fun little tool. You can actually download and use it. If you've used Metasploit, I believe they have payloads that have Mimikatz capabilities built into it too. And it's definitely very interesting seeing this as a popular tool going through our boxes this quarter.
You can definitely see why the bad guys choose to use it, even though it is such a relatively old tool. So one of the other variants that we saw this quarter was that JavaScript-based, let's go back one more. Oh, before that, Jenna, we actually have a polling question.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. We're going to give the audience about a minute to answer this polling question.
So this relates to the JavaScript we're going to talk about, but do you think your employees are sufficiently trained to identify phishing attacks? Of course, by phishing, you guys know that's the email you get that seems to come from a legitimate person or organization that's really trying to get your employees to do something they shouldn't.
And
go ahead.
And as you've probably noticed, they've evolved over the years now, where instead of just blanket phishing campaigns, like ones you might say, like from a Nigerian prince trying to get money out of you, there's a lot more targeted phishing attacks, which is called spear phishing lately, where these cyber criminals will actually take details from your social media accounts, for example, or maybe your organization chart, and use them to tailor these emails to be much more convincing to actually attack you.
Good examples are ones targeted to HR at a company, or maybe finance at a company, where they might use your CFO's name in an email to try to get someone in the finance department to do a wire transfer.
And guys, just an update, we're experiencing a little bit of a polling question glitch on the BrightTalk end of things. We have 3 more polling questions later on in the presentation for you, so we'll try to get it worked out before then.
All right. So actually, it looks like quite a few of the audience members answered the polling question just using the chat from the audience, and it seems to be a pretty mixed bag of yes and no, which is about what I would expect. Yeah, or can't vote. And that's about what I expect. It seems that phishing awareness training lately it seems to be picking up finally. Yeah. Organizations are recognizing the need that you need to train your employees past just installing technical protections. You need to keep them as your weakest link protected from these types of attacks.
For the folks saying no, if you haven't started phishing training, it's a lot easier than you might think nowadays, because there's a lot of automated tools that can do it. You know, I think one of the hardest parts about any sort of security awareness training is the IT guy doesn't want to have to build an itinerary, a curriculum to train his employees, and may not be a good trainer. He may not know how to do it. But nowadays for phishing training, there's a lot of packaged programs, organizations like KnowBe4, where the training is essentially phishing your own employees. They'll send fake phishing emails to your employees, and you'll get an idea of how many of your employees might fall for it. But on top of that, sometimes some of the training will use that email as part of the training. When they click on the bad thing, that's a perfect opportunity to, without kind of making them feel bad, just tell them, hey, that might have been a mistake. Here's how you should look for some clues in email. But long story short, there's automated tools out there that will help you phish your own employees. I think they're a good way to train.
And using that as a segue, one of the other things that we mentioned from our Q2 security report, is the slide going to go forward? Let's see.
Sorry, we're waiting for a slide forwarding issue.
Well, while we're waiting for that to get fixed, one of the things that we mentioned was we saw a lot of JavaScript-based phishing attacks. And when we actually looked into some of the samples that we detected, they seemed to be using a common theme where they would be some sort of attachment to an email. And within that attachment, they'd be using JavaScript to make it look like a legitimate website that you might need to log into to get something like a secure document, or something where you need to actually enter corporate credentials. And that seems to be a common theme. We've actually seen attempted phishing attacks against our own employees here at WatchGuard from actual bad guys, where they use a high-ranking employee's name trying to get other employees to click a link and enter their credentials. And we actually detected quite a lot of that. When we're able to move forward in the slide, we actually have a screenshot from one of them where you'll see it attempts to mimic Google Documents, if you're familiar with using Google Docs. one of the things you have to do to access some documents is actually log in your Google account. And this JavaScript-based malware used HTML and JavaScript to mirror what Google Docs' login screen looks like, and then it used that JavaScript to actually ship your password off to the bad guys instead of actually being a legitimate website.
Yeah, by the way, and the one takeaway you can learn from this, again, sorry you're not seeing our slide updates, but we're going to just continue until we figure out the issue on the back end. But one of the quick takeaways on this particular one is this arrives as an email that actually has an attachment that was JS. If I remember right, this was email-based JavaScript, right, Mark?
Correct.
So the one thing is, if you ever get email attachments that have JavaScript in them, there's no legitimate reason I can think of to use that. I mean, you might get an HTML email that might have JavaScript in it, but if you ever get an attachment or a zip attachment with .js, which is common for a lot of ransomware too, by the way, that is just something you should be blocking as an email attachment. One of the capabilities of the Firebox proxy is the capability to pick what file types you can block. And I think it's a pretty easy decision to never allow .js attachments in email. So one quick takeaway from that particular thing.
Yep.
Moving on to the next slide, even though you can't see it, again, we apologize for the technical glitch, but the next slide talks about some of the regional malware detection we got. Besides, giving you the top 10 malware, we talk about different regions. We start with the high level, the Americas, EMEA, Europe and Middle East, and then Asia Pacific. And surprisingly, 47%, most of the malware hits we saw, 47% were in Europe. Obviously, the Americas, largely North America and some of LATAM, are a close second at 39.4% of the malware out there. And finally, APAC is where we see the least malware. Hard to say whether or not that's based on how many devices WatchGuard has in that region versus if it's really less malware there. But APAC only had about 13.3% of the malware. We can also give you some of the, specific regional issues for some of the malware out there. For instance, Perl Shellbot was one of the malware instances we found, and strangely enough, it primarily affected Malaysia and the United States. And I don't know if there's any other ones you can remember.
Not off the top of my head.
I think the other ones is generic Word documents. A lot of malicious Word documents commonly show up in our top 10 list and further down in the top 50. And whenever we see these malicious Word documents, like 90-some% of them affect the U.S., were found in the U.S., but then kind of 3% of them are in China. Not sure what that relation is, but it does seem that a lot of these malware out there sending malicious Word documents are targeting U.S. victims. The fact that we see some in China leads me to suspect that that may be where the Word documents are coming from.
And then moving on, we just go back one more time to our zero-day malware number where 53% of the malware that we detected was detected via signature-based detection, which is really good at quickly catching the bread and butter malware, as I like to say. But 47% of that malware we detected in Q2 would have missed signature-based detection and was instead caught by our sandbox-based detection, just highlighting the need for multiple layers and potentially the end of the life for legacy signature-based malware detection.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to just rely on legacy signature-based detection. If anything, our report has shown us, I think it started with a little over 30% of malware was zero-day, then it went up to a higher 30%, and now we're at 47. So quite a bit of malware is missed by basic gateway antivirus. I think if you haven't heard of Bad Robot, the ransomworm that I mentioned before, it just came out on Tuesday. But Bad Robot, we actually tracked it as soon as we learned about it the day it came out. And the samples we saw, if you go to VirusTotal, if you haven't heard of virustotal.com, it's a great site where you can submit hashes or files to see whether or not AV vendors, 60-some AV vendors, call it bad or good. And the early bad rabbit samples, many of the gateway-based AV vendors or the signature pattern-based AV vendors were not detecting it at 0 hour right away. I mean, later in the day, they started catching up. But that's exactly why you need advanced threat protection. You need something more proactive about catching malware.
Exactly. So moving on, we're going to go ahead and transition to our network attack stats, where instead of malware samples being sent to and from a network, these are actual attempted exploitations of different vulnerabilities in systems. And two of the main trends that we saw when it came to network attacks in quarter two were, as we mentioned, the authentication and password theft attacks, but then we also saw some SQL injection targeted towards servers that were running on a Ruby on Rails front end. When it comes to the actual attacks, our number one for this last quarter was a cross-site scripting attack, which is actually pretty common when it comes to network security vulnerabilities in web servers. But we saw multiple different network attacks targeted towards authentication, which is something that we found very interesting.
I will say the other trend to notice here, notice that or I guess if you could see the slide, which we'll definitely share with you after this Bright Talk thing, if you could see our top 10 IPS hits, every signature name starts with web. What we found consistently in all three of our reports is these network software vulnerabilities tend to focus on web delivery, whether that be web server-side vulnerabilities, meaning flaws in your actual web server like IIS, Apache, Ruby on Rails, whatever web framework you use, or even your own custom web application code for like cross-site scripting, or they would be vulnerabilities on your web client, a browser-side vulnerability, which could be in Internet Explorer, Safari, Chrome, or it could be in some of the plugins you use like Flash or Java. But in either case, whether it's web server or web client based, our top 10 is consistently being web-based attacks. So clearly the web is the battleground as far as network exploits go. Those are the servers that you need to patch, harden, securely code first. But back to authentication. Did you, Mark, want to jump into the next?
Sure. We were moving forward. It looks like it's stuck again. So we mentioned two specific, we mentioned our trend for authentication-based network attacks. And it came down to two different types of attacks that we saw. One of them was a brute force login attempt. So this is a fairly generic IPS signature that's going to look for bad guys attempting to brute force login forms, which is one of the most common, at least in my opinions, one of the most common attacks that we would probably see on a website that has login.
Yeah, it should be. I mean, any website should have some throttling mechanism, but there's
Correct.
Tools like THC Hydra, like decade-old tools that are literally designed just to try all kinds of brute force passwords in a web mechanism.
Yep, and the other one that we saw was actually, it wasn't necessarily geared directly towards authentication, but it did still involve that credential theft that we mentioned earlier. And this was a vulnerability found in a few web servers, Linux-based web servers, that could have allowed a bad guy to effectively read what's called the etc passwd file on a Linux server. And if you're not familiar with Linux, that file historically, at least in older versions of Linux, stores hashed passwords for that server itself. Newer servers have transitioned to the etc shadow file, which is a more secure way of storing passwords. It's only readable by system root if you're familiar with permissions, whereas etc passwd is readable by any user on the system, which is part of this vulnerability allowing it to be read. Exactly.
Why this should have been fixed a long time ago.
Yep, and you might think, all right, the passwords are hashed, they might be safe, but as we mentioned in part of our description in the report, a very common tool the bad guys use are things called rainbow tables, where the bad guys will pre-compute a lot of different hashes for different passwords, and if these passwords happen to be common or frequently reused, it's very easy for them to get them immediately.
And really any password under 7 or 8 characters is, even if you don't have a rainbow table, computationally it only takes 24 hours or so to get through 7 characters. So this is why everyone says a strong password is long. By the way, while we're talking about hashing, here's some nerdy tips for you. This is only if you manage a web application. But how you hash a password is critically important. Like anyone just using an MD5 for a password is, I hate to say it, an idiot. There's rainbow tables, like Mark said, for those MD5 passwords. It takes no time at all to brute force them. So 2 things to consider. One is add a little seasoning to your hash. Add a salt is what they call it. And it's basically another bit of information let's call it a key, it could be a timestamp. It's based on an algorithm. You combine a salt and a hash together to get a kind of different hash, and that makes all these MD5 pre-computed rainbow tables not work anymore because they're not meant to work with your salt. Another thing I can tell you, by the way, is bcrypt. I assume any web application or database application, it's not, you're not writing your own hash code. There's all kinds of standards for doing it today. If you're going to pick a standard, bcrypt is one of the best ones out there right now. Besides salting, I believe it does automatically. Bcrypt is actually one of the ones that's slow.
It's purposefully designed to be slow.
Yes.
Because when you're authenticating a user, it's okay if it takes, half a second computationally on your server.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to brute force a ton of passwords,
half a second's a ton of time when you're going through literally billions of tries. So bcrypt is a good one because it's much harder to brute force. So if you have web applications with a database backend, make sure that bcrypt is the hash variable you use.
So moving forward, we all do more regional-based breakouts of our different network attack trends. We actually saw it's fairly similar to what we saw with malware. EMEA, so Europe and the Middle East, saw the bulk of our network attacks at 59%. The Americas were in second place at 35.6%. And then APAC was all the way down at 5% of our detected network attacks. When it came to individual signatures, there were a few that jumped out at us. Suspicious iframes, so these are potentially malicious iframes or embedded web elements, were primarily targeting the Americas, so United States and Canada. And then that major cross-site scripting, our number one hit for this last quarter, was actually primarily targeting Spain with 90% of our detections, which is a very large percentage.
Yeah, so those are some of the regional things, but before we're going to start moving after malware and IPS, we start to get into some of our more specific sections of the report, like the latest news and research. But before we do, why don't we ask another polling question? We'll cross our fingers and hope that this polling question works and doesn't crash our presentation again. But have you or your company ever been a victim of ransomware attack? So this time it looks like we're getting some results. I'll go ahead and wait 30 more seconds because they're changing as we speak. But obviously ransomware is a huge issue right now. If I were giving you this presentation live, I would ask the audience how many of you are sick of hearing about ransomware, because I always joke that I've been talking about it for 4 years now, and even some before then, and I'm absolutely bored of the subject. The problem is it's making criminals literally billions of dollars.
Yeah, it became a billion-dollar industry last year, which is insane.
And it's losing companies even more than that, because even some, we'll talk about a ransomware variant from Q2 that cost companies way more than the criminals actually made just in cleanup costs and recovering their business. So despite the fact we're all kind of sick of hearing the term ransomware, it is a critical issue to businesses nowadays, so something we need to talk about. But it looks like we have poll results. I don't know if you wanted to share them, Mark.
Yeah, so it looks like based off the question, have you been the victim of a ransomware attack, 39% of our audience said yes, they have been, and 60% said no. So that's around 40% have been the victim.
Number. Yeah, cool. So why are we talking about this? Well, there's a huge ransomware variant that came out in Q2. But before I get into this, I want to brag a little. One of the things that me and my threat team does every year is we release security predictions for the year. And there's 2 security predictions we released in December of 2016 for this year. The first prediction kind of directly correlates to the subject of ransomware we'll be talking about. But the first was in 2017, we would see the first ever ransom worm. And notice I have worm in that particular definition. That's on purpose. If you've been in the industry for a while, you know a worm is a specific piece of malware that's designed to spread automatically without user interaction on networks. So once it infects one computer, it tends to scan normally internal networks, but it could scan external networks too, looking for ways to spread automatically over the network, whether that way be a network exploit, for instance, maybe a Microsoft file sharing flaw, Or it could be just stolen credentials. We've talked about Mimikatz. Mimikatz can automatically grab network credentials that malware can use to log into other systems and install stuff. So that was the first directly ransomware-related prediction. The second prediction we had, which hopefully you'll find how it's related, is I predicted in 2017 we'd see the first ever civilian casualty, quote unquote, in a cyber Cold War. Now, I probably need to unpack all that for you. What do I mean by a cyber Cold War? Well, first of all, I think you probably know by watching the news that governments or nation states are deeply involved in the cybers, in cybersecurity, primarily network attacks. You know, a lot of them have red teams. A lot of them are using real network attacks for espionage purposes, allegedly to manipulate elections, definitely to DDoS, countries that they may be going to physically occupy, and things like that. I'm sure you've all heard of Stuxnet, which was something probably the U.S. government in Israel did to attack centrifuges in Iran. Whether you think that's good or not, countries around the world, every single country pretty much that's a major power, is using cyber attacks as part of their arsenal. And in a cyber war, the kind of weapon of mass destruction is that zero-day exploit we talked about earlier, is a unknown flaw or unknown by the vendor software vulnerability in a product that your adversary uses. So maybe an unknown Windows flaw, a unknown flaw in iOS that can allow someone to take control of the device. And the problem with this, in my opinion, is that governments are starting to stockpile these 0 days. If a government finds a flaw in Windows that nobody knows about, it's not in their best interest to let Microsoft know and fix it, because that removes their capability to use it. So when I say a cyber Cold War, to me that means stockpiling these 0-day vulnerabilities. And the civilian casualty to this, I personally believe stockpiling 0-day is dangerous. The software that these governments are targeting is the same software civilians use: Windows, iPhones, Android, so on and so forth. And if one person can find a software vulnerability, someone else can. A criminal actor can, another country can, or that flaw could leak. So this prediction was essentially saying that something that was in a government stockpile would somehow leak and get used to attack a civilian organization. So why do I bring up these two predictions, Mark?
Well, lo and behold, in Q2, we saw what I'm sure most of you have probably heard of, the WannaCry ransomware attack. Jenna, are you able to move the slide forward?
By the way, Jenna, the slide's not forwarding. If you could look into that while we keep talking.
Yeah.
So you're missing our WannaCry slide, but go ahead, Mark.
So WannaCry it wasn't necessarily the most massive ransomware attack. It didn't earn criminals the most money. I don't think it infected the most systems. But what it was a major evolution in how ransomware actually works. Now, traditionally, ransomware spreads by malicious attachments to emails or web servers. But WannaCry actually bucked this trend, and it required no user interaction whatsoever in order to spread. WannaCry actually, so we call that its worm-like properties. So that's prediction number one knocked off the list. And how it actually spread like a network worm was using a exploit developed by the United States NSA, allegedly.
Yeah, so almost not allegedly, because we see the leaked documents and the leaked exploit came out. So WannaCry used MS17010. That's the Microsoft Security Bulletin number for a SMB flaw. SMB stands for Server Message Block. It's essentially one of the file sharing protocols Windows uses. And I believe I always get the CIA Vault 7 leaks mixed up with shadow brokers, but I believe this flaw was a shadow brokers leak. Is that correct, Mark?
This one was the Equation Group.
The Equation Group.
Yep.
Oh, the Equation Group
shadow brokers
is
leaking the Equation.
Equation Group was the code name for the NSA's internal, one of their tailored access operation groups, which is their fancy government speak for red team pen testers that attack other countries. And an organization called the Shadow Brokers, whether it was some sort of insider leak or something else, gained access to many of the Equation Group's tools, which included this zero-day vulnerability. In fact, a couple of zero-day vulnerabilities, which they called Eternal Blue. Again, that's the NSA code name. So these were unfixed flaws in Microsoft Windows file and network sharing. Now, the truth be told, on May 12th, when WannaCry came out, this was patched just under a month earlier. Microsoft had sneaked a patch in for MS 17010. While there's no, publicly available information on this, a lot of people think the NSA tipped off Microsoft that, hey, this is out there now, you need to make sure to patch this. Nonetheless, it was within the month that this was patched, meaning there's a lot of systems in the world that hadn't applied that update yet. And of course, there were also some XP systems which don't get security updates anymore unless Microsoft makes a specific patch, which they later did for this. But long story short, it was that unpatched networking issue that allowed WannaCry to spread much more widely than the average malware. And of course, the fact that this was a leaked NSA exploit kind of verified that second prediction as well. As Marc said, this did not make a ton of money. You can actually easily follow the Bitcoin wallet. While buying a wallet, you can be semi-anonymous. You can't kind of hide your transactions. So I think, Marc, you followed their wallet, and they made well under
$14,000, I think.
Yeah.
Well under $100,000. It was a very small amount, but it was still dramatic in terms of a ransomware because it was just such a huge shift from what we have seen previously.
Meanwhile, there's companies like Maersk, which I believe Maersk is a big shipping container company that ships stuff on boats. They were disrupted for a few days. FedEx was disrupted. Obviously, WannaCry disrupted some UK hospitals, which could have life-threatening, consequences. So business-wise, this probably cost businesses upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more.
And in our Internet Security Report, we actually dedicate a section to going through and describing exactly how WannaCry works. We did a fairly in-depth analysis of the actual WannaCry ransomware. I'll go over it at a very high level here really quickly, and basically what it does is after it installs on a system, its network worm starts scanning for new targets. Scans both locally and on the internet, and it's looking specifically for open SMB access, which is, as we mentioned, server message block. It's used for traditionally file sharing over networks. Unfortunately, a lot of networks, for one reason or another, open SMB access to the internet, which is a pretty poor practice, but it allowed WannaCry to spread.
Yeah, if you're opening Windows file sharing to the internet, don't do that. Takeaway number one, it's an easy firewall rule to block.
So when WannaCry detects open SMB access on a local host, it immediately just tries to exploit that host using that Eternal Blue vulnerability that was released by or leaked by the NSA. When it detects open SMB access on the internet, it actually expands its scan to detect the entire what we call Class C subnet. It's basically adding 250 or so more addresses to its scan. And then on each of those, if it detects SMB, it tries to exploit it there as well. So at no point did WannaCry actually require any interaction from the victim. They didn't have to open an email and click an attachment or go to a bad website. It was if you had open SMB access and your system was not patched, WannaCry would find it and infect it, which was pretty scary at the time.
By the way, if this were a true zero-day, which it almost was, meaning if Microsoft didn't have that patch 20-some days before, it could have been even a bigger nightmare.
Exactly. So we actually had one more prediction that we feel like hit the nail pretty much on the head. You want to explain this, Corey?
Yeah, so last year we saw the Mirai botnet, which was a botnet that targeted IoT devices, largely web IP cams and the DVRs used to record video from web IP cams or CCTVs. So our prediction, obviously Mirai grew to a huge botnet and was used to create record-breaking distributed denial of service attacks. And to me it also showed that bad guys figured out how to monetize IoT. Security researchers like me and Marc have been talking about how dangerous or insecure many of these new IoT devices are. But over the past 5 years, even though we knew how insecure these devices are, we didn't really see many hackers in the wild that figured out a way to really criminalize or monetize an IoT attack. A lot of people say, okay, I can attack a refrigerator, but why do I need to spoil someone's milk? To me, Mirai, the IoT botnet that caused DDoSes, really showed the criminal community how they could monetize those attacks. DDoS is great for extortion. More importantly, a botnet gives an attacker hundreds of thousands of resources that they can use well beyond just DDoS attacks. They can use it for click and ad fraud. They can use it for their spam malware campaigns. So really, this prediction was ultimately that we would see all botnet herders moving to IoT as their victim of choice. It's a great place to hide an infected, client, a bot in a network, because people don't suspect their webcam. And they would expand their botnet's capabilities. They're not only going to be DDoSing people, but they'll start using it for spam and click fraud and stuff like that.
So as part of our previous reports, we include a research section where we actually do some active research on a device or a subject and try and provide different knowledge for that particular subject. In previous reports, we actually went out and bought IoT devices, tried to find and actually successfully found vulnerabilities with them, and then worked with the manufacturers to try to get them resolved and then report them in a responsible manner. For this report, we actually talk about our IoT honeypot, which is actually a full honeynet with a series of honeypots where we are trying to pretend to be IoT devices to watch attack trends from these criminals trying to take over these devices. Now, some of the key things we look for, we're trying to identify just on a basic level malicious IP addresses. So because we are not allowing access to these honeypots, by nature, anyone attempting to connect to them is probably trying to do something nefarious. We try and look for web hosts that are serving malware. So this could be compromised or actually malicious websites where once an attacker gets into our honeypots, they're going to try and download a malware payload onto them. We can identify where that payload's coming from. And then in general, we just try and see the attack trends that the bad guys are using today when it comes to IoT devices.
It's great for getting what they call TTPs, tools, tactics, and procedures. Like most malware or attacks are automated today, so it might be a script doing stuff. But occasionally you'll see a human actor, you'll see what tools they download. I'm sure Marc will talk about the sample you see up there. But you'll see the tools that are most common, what they tend to do to the host first once they get on it. So honeypots are a great way to really learn what attackers and malware are doing at a lower level.
Exactly. So the honeynet that we focus on in our Q2 report was actually our SSH and Telnet. So if you're not familiar with them, they're command line protocols traditionally used for managing networked appliances, things like that, on a command line level. And there's no real reason for an IoT device to have SSH and Telnet, but unfortunately, quite a few of them do.
At the very least, not exposed to the darn internet.
Exactly.
I mean, these have web management. Maybe you could argue that it needs CLI for something, but you should never have that exposed to any sort of external network.
So we intentionally exposed our honeypots to the internet, and we also set them up in a way where after 3 failed login attempts for some of them, or some of them right away, we just allow the bad guys in saying, whatever you entered, yep, that is the correct username and password, come on in.
Yep.
And then we try and monitor exactly what they do once they're in. So a lot of the times, or I would say the vast majority of the times, it's all automated. It seems to be bots trolling the internet, looking for vulnerable devices, and then immediately running commands to try and affect those devices. Now, we go into it in quite a bit of detail in the Q2 report, but in this little snippet, you can see just one single command goes and tries to download several bash scripts, which then in turn actually tried to download the Mirai botnet onto this particular honeypot.
And really all the details, if you actually edit some of those scripts it's downloading, you can see its process for what it does after.
Yep.
So again, check out the report for all of that, but very interesting to watch.
And I think we have one more polling question in here, which was a bit of a fun one. So as we spin up these honeypots, how long do you think on average it takes for attackers to find our newly developed IoT honeypots and begin attacking them? Your options are 30 seconds, 30 minutes, 30 hours, or 30 days. And this is, we're periodically spinning up new to try and gather data and just to see how long it takes for them to actually be found out there on the internet.
And depending on the answer to this, we'll get your poll results and also give you the answer, but it kind of will show you how automated attacks have become.
Exactly. And one of my favorite things to actually do in our threat lab is to sit in one of these honeypots and just watch the logs real time, because it's honestly fascinating watching some of the different ways that these attackers try and get in and what they try and do once they're in a honeypot.
So while we're waiting for the answer, I just got to share with the audience one of Marc's nerdy cool little tools. He just bought this little LED device. It's like an LED matrix of lights that I think you hooked up to a
The Unicorn Pi Hat.
The Unicorn Pi Hat. and he hooked it up to his honeypots, and it basically has all green LEDs, but as soon as someone connects to one of his SSH honeypots, one of the LEDs turns red. I don't think you don't really need to use it, but it's just fun to visually see whenever people are connecting to our honeypot and doing something they shouldn't be.
And usually it's just like polka dots here and there, but some days I'll come into the office and the entire screen is red. And I'm like, oh wow, time to go log in and see what's going on there.
Cool, so I think our poll is built. I don't know if you want to share the results.
Sure, so 39% of our audience thinks that it's 30 seconds, 53%, the majority think it's 30 minutes, 6% say 30 hours, and 1% say 30 days. And the correct answer, because this actually has a correct answer for us at least, was A, 30 seconds is how long on average it takes for these automated bad guys to detect Open Telnet or SSH on one of these newly deployed honeypots and immediately try and attack it, infiltrate it, and download malware.
And the takeaway here is that if you ever packet sniff on an open internet connection, there is a constant noise on the internet of these sorts of scans of common services. A lot of times it's criminal actors and automated attacks, but there's even things like Shodan.io. If you've ever seen, these websites that are dedicated to scanning the internet constantly and giving you it's basically Google for devices on the internet. It's all based on scanning. So there's always this background noise of scans looking for new network services on different new IPs and trying to connect to them. So just something to know, even though a firewall, the basic firewall, is really the least common denominator of security right now compared to all the services you can add to a firewall, it's still very important to have a firewall, because if you don't, you're going to be getting hit by all these automated scans.
Exactly. So we'll try and go through our key takeaways quickly here so we can get to some Q&A afterwards. But we have main three key takeaways from our report that we want to go over. The first one is our report really highlights the need for phishing awareness training. We saw JavaScript-based phishing attacks in the top 10 for the first time, but phishing is not new. It's something that's been around for a while, and it's one of the primary ways for bad guys to infect your network with malware or take sensitive information out of your network. And you can have the best technical protections in the world, but your employee is always going to be your weakest link. And keeping them educated on ways to spot bad emails will do a huge amount to actually protecting your network.
Yeah, and I agree with what Marc just said. The main argument for phishing training being such a thing you need to do is there's no technology control that will ever be perfect. WatchGuard has a ton of things that help with phishing. I mean, our anti-spam will cut down on the mass sent phishing. Our GAV and APT blocker will often remove the malicious attachments in phishing email. Things like Web Blocker and our reputation-enabled defense might catch some of the phishing links. But ultimately, with low-volume spear phishing and with all kinds of new ways for things like a fresh Word document to try to evade your security, you're never going to have perfect defense, technological defense against phishing. So I personally think it's critically important to train users as well. And again, there's lots of tools nowadays that will just fish your users for you and provide that education automatically. The second takeaway here we'll talk about is, we mentioned at the beginning, the main theme here was authentication and passwords. There were a lot of attacks that were designed to steal credentials, to get past all your security. So it's really, really important to, one, harden any identity server. Anything that stores or has passwords, you definitely want that sucker patched. You don't want it to suffer from an old Linux exe password issue. You want to make sure it's patched. It only is allowing bare minimum services to it. But I think the biggest solution for this has to be multi-factor authentication. Passwords are not a bad token for authentication. They can be used badly if people use the same password everywhere and use short passwords, but if you use them right, they're not horrible, but they will never be perfect. And guess what? While we move to new authentication tokens like a biometric, a fingerprint, or a facial scan, those too are good tokens and actually might be easier for users to use, but I guarantee you they will have vulnerabilities too. So I believe the only way to really protect authentication is combine two tokens, two or more. I don't care what tokens you pick. You can pick two biometrics. You can pick a biometric and a password. You can pick a certificate and a hardware token. You pick whatever factors you want, But multi-factor authentication is what's going to really protect your user's authentication.
And our final key takeaway real quick.
Before we jump into that, I just want to do a little WatchGuard pimping. I do want to share a little bit about WatchGuard. Just so you know out there, there's no product yet, but if you follow WatchGuard news, you might see a press release that we just acquired a company called DataBlink, who does multi-factor authentication. So if you just want to know how strongly we believe in multi-factor authentication, WatchGuard just bought a multi-factor authentication company, and sometime next year, early next year, you'll see us release our own multi-factor authentication solution for customers out there as well. Exactly. It really is a cornerstone of security.
It is.
Go ahead with the final.
No problem. So the final key takeaway was advanced malware protection is a requirement for your network. As we saw, that zero-day malware number that we tracked throughout quarter after quarter reached all the way up to 47%. So if you had no advanced malware protection, if you were just relying on signature-based detection, you would have missed 47% of the malware that we detected in quarter 2. So now that we've done takeaways, I think we still have at least 5 minutes for a few Q&A questions.
Jenna, should we just read them off, or does Jenna want to have you picked any, Jenna? We'll be happy to go through them ourselves, too.
Great, thank you guys. Sure, we have quite a few great questions, so if you want to maybe tackle your favorites out of the list.
Sure, I'll let you do some, of course, too, Mark. I noticed one right at the top of the list. We'll go down and make sure we'll catch the earlier ones, too. One person mentioned for security awareness training they use KnowBe4. I just wanted to point out KnowBe4 is a great example of having good phishing awareness training. One of the reasons you might like it is KnowBe4 is kind of headed by Kevin Mitnick, a well-known social engineer and hacker. So while I don't think he writes all the training, he mostly talks for the company. Any training based on his intelligence will probably help you find social engineering. So KnowBe4 is a great training, and we actually have been partnering with them for some things.
One of the other questions we saw in here was, do you have any statistics for attacks coming from email versus web? We actually weren't able to cram that into this hour-long webinar, but we go actually fairly in-depth in an entire section in the quarterly report on where these attacks are originating from and what they are targeting, whether they be email versus web.
And by the way, we mentioned one takeaway that comes from that section. For instance, I would have just expected a year ago that most JavaScript attacks would happen over the web because JavaScript is typically used on websites. But you'll see in our report that most of the JavaScript stuff we see is coming through email, which is kind of interesting.
Another one I've seen here is a segregated network enough to stop the spread of these ransomware worms on the inside? Unless you're segregating each individual host on their own subnet, it's not enough to protect everything. Yes, it might save your infected desktop computers from infecting your servers, but you're still going to have a huge amount of damage on the inside without some sort of, whether it be endpoint protection or something along those lines to stop it going from host to host. Now, segregation is very important in terms of network security, especially when it comes to IoT devices as well, where you want to keep these, what I call hyper-vulnerable devices, on their own segments. That way, if something were to happen to one of them, it can't spread to your other hosts on your network. You want to pick one up, Corey?
Yeah, one of the questions, by the way, I wanted to bring up just because it's relevant and timely. Someone asked, was crack included in this report? If you haven't heard of crack, it's a new WPA2 Wi-Fi attack. It stands for Key Reinstallation Attack. By the way, it's bad form to use attack in your crack attack acronym.
But it sounds cool.
Yeah, there we go. But anyways, no, it wasn't included in this report, but actually we are currently writing next quarter's report, and this is one of the subjects we're considering talking about. If you do want some information on this crack attack now, go to Secplicity, S-E-C-Plicity, P-L-I-C-I-T-Y. Did I spell it right?
Sure.
Secplicity.org, which is WatchGuard's Threat Labs blog. I do videos regularly there, and we have a video on the crack attack. It actually is a pretty concerning attack. The good news is Wi-Fi vendors, whether they be OS clients or access point vendors around the world, will be patching this so it's fixable. But in the meantime, the main takeaway is that even if you use a WPA2 protected Wi-Fi network, you might want to VPN all your traffic, otherwise people might be able to sniff it.
And WatchGuard customers that are using secure cloud Wi-Fi, we patched that the day of that the vulnerability was announced.
Yeah, we actually worked before they released
Correct.
it. They disclosed it to us so that we could patch it early.
Yep, and those that are using the tabletop-based appliances, we have a patch in the works that's coming out very soon.
By the way, I just wanted to share one user's anonymous, one of the anecdotes he shared to give you an idea of how threatening spear phishing is. Again, the targeted one that's going after specific people. One of our audience mentioned that they lost 10,000 pounds due to a spear phishing attack. I wish I could talk more with him without disclosing his company, but I would ask him what kind of email it was. But I would guess it might be, you can tell us in the comments if you want, but wire transfers, the ones that go after accountants. Even here at WatchGuard, our accounting department has been very good at figuring out how not only to identify phishing emails, but to identify something called smishing, SMS phishing. And if you know, SMS stands for texting. We even have had the cases where our accountants would get text messages seeming to come from C-levels asking to do wire transfers. And basically, they use voice over IP hacks to spoof a phone number of your executive, so it actually looks like it comes from a valid phone number. So anyways, I would suspect that might be one way you would lose 10K pretty quickly.
And it looks like we're just about out of time. Do you have time for one more question, Jenna?
I think we have time for just one more quick question, Mark. Thanks.
All right, so one that I wanted to answer was, what's the best strategy to manage a JavaScript download, and what about the exe and other type of files? So one of the main takeaways from our report is most of these JavaScript attacks actually come in via email. And as Corey mentioned earlier, you should not be seeing JavaScript attached to an email. There are very, very few legitimate uses for that. I would go so far as to say that if you're a WatchGuard customer with our SMTP proxy, you can just block all JavaScript, and you're probably not going to get too much collateral damage in the way when it comes to JavaScript via email. Obviously, on the web, JavaScript runs the internet.
It's important.
You can't just block JavaScript on the internet, but you can use tools in your browser, things like NoScript and ScriptSafe, to try and block malicious JavaScript in your browser. The attack surface when it comes to a browser is much harder to exploit than it is with email, which drops a file directly onto your computer.
Yep.
These bad guys in web-based JavaScript are trying to use things like exploit kits to take over.
They have to figure out how to get past same domain or same origin policies. So it's a little harder to exploit through the web, but they definitely do it all the time.
Exactly.
Real quick, I want to go through a ton of real questions. One, someone mentioned, will WatchGuard's 2FA in the future provide VPN multi-factor authentication? To tell you pretty quickly, like I mentioned, we bought a multi-factor authentication company. We'll release something early next year. This will be a great standalone or Firebox multi-factor authentication solution. It will provide just enterprise multi-factor authentication, meaning logging into your Windows desktops or your Apple desktops. You could add multi-factor just to that normal enterprise login, but of course it's going to work with VPNs as well. It obviously will work with all of WatchGuard's products very well, but we plan on also making it interoperate with any VPN product out there that we can, because it's going to be a standalone product
all right.
as well.
Sorry, Jenna, your turn.
All right, thank you guys so much. Bright Talk is about to kick us off this webinar, but a huge thank you to Corey and Mark for all of the great information today. Great stuff, guys. To our attendees, thank you for joining us and for taking a little bit of time out of your day to sit with us through this webinar. Please be sure to check out the attachments tab for Corey and Mark's Q2 Internet Security Report, as well as the PowerPoint deck that they used during the presentation today. We'll see you for next quarter's Internet Security Report, but until then, have a great day, guys.
Thanks, Jenna.
Cheers.